The night pressed in with a weight that matched the frigid air, a cold that slithered through the cracks in the world, unrelenting. Alexander Grant's breath, sharp and quick in the frost, formed little clouds in front of him as he made his way down the sleek, empty street. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their glass facades glowing with the polished light of wealth, but all around him, the world felt silent and abandoned, swallowed up by the darkness. He had just left a meeting that would seal another deal, another triumph on his list of endless successes, yet even as he walked, the tension in his chest remained. It wasn't the kind of tension born from competition or strategy. It was something else, something he didn't have the time to deal with. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gleam of gold reflecting his calculated steps. Every inch of him, from the sharp cut of his suit to the flawless shine of his shoes, spoke of control. He owned everything in his life, his companies, his image, his success. But more than that, he owned the space around him. No one dared encroach. No one dared interrupt the world he had meticulously crafted. Alexander Grant wasn't the man who stopped to help others. He didn't need to. The world moved in a way that allowed him to dictate it. He made choices, set rules, and never faltered. People were part of the equation, but they were never the point. Everything he did was strategic. Emotion never played a part in the calculations. It was something he learned early, something that had allowed him to rise from nothing, to become the architect of his own empire. He wasn't about to let that change now. But then, as his heels clicked softly on the icy pavement, a sound broke through the stillness. A whisper, carried on the biting wind, a voice so fragile, it seemed almost unreal. "I'm so cold. May I come in, please?" The words wrapped around him like a thread, tugging at something deep inside, something he had buried long ago. He didn't stop. He couldn't. His pace remained unbroken. The world around him, nothing more than a blur of sharp lines and distant lights. But the voice stayed. The image of the small figure remained in his mind, vivid and unwelcome. He didn't turn. Not then. There was nothing for him to see, nothing that should have mattered. The city was his kingdom, and he didn't entertain distractions. People like her didn't belong in his world. They didn't belong in this city, where success was measured by power, and weakness was left to the streets to swallow. Yet as he moved forward, something in the pit of his stomach twisted. He could feel the weight of her words, the desperation that clung to them. "May I come in, please?" The simple plea echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind. He should have walked on. He should have ignored it, like he had ignored so many things over the years, the cries for help, the pleas for compassion. He didn't have the luxury of sentiment. Not anymore. But the image of her, standing there, small and alone, haunted him. Her clothes were ragged, mismatched. A child's clothing made to stretch and last, but stretched to thin. Her hair was tangled and unkempt, a mess of curls that framed her face like a portrait of exhaustion. Bare feet stood frozen on the sidewalk, her frailty stark against the cold, polished glamour of the city. She had nothing, no one, yet her eyes, wide and unknowing for someone so small, held a glimpse of something else, a sliver of hope. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, in the way she watched him, as if he might be the one person who could make her world right again. Alexander's mind flashed, briefly, to his own past, the boy who once stood alone, hungry, abandoned in a cold world that didn't care. But it was a fleeting thought, gone before it could even take root. He had shed that boy long ago. This wasn't his problem. The world was full of people who needed saving. He had learned long ago that he couldn't save them all, and so, with a final, subtle shake of his head, he chose to walk away, dismissing her and the sudden ripple of unease that had settled in his chest. The sound of his footsteps grew louder as he moved further down the street, the sharpness of the night sinking into his skin, but her voice lingered. He couldn't shake it. "I'm so cold. May I come in, please?" He paused, just for a moment, but it felt like an eternity. The wind howled through the empty streets again, carrying the faint sound of her plea into the night, and as he stood there, alone with his thoughts, something inside him began to crack. Alexander Grant stood there for a long moment, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. The wind had quieted, leaving only the distant hum of the city behind him. He was still, a statue of indecision on the darkened street. His gaze turned back towards the small figure that had lingered in his mind. She was still there, just as he had left her, frozen, waiting, as if she had expected him to turn back all along. For a moment, he thought of turning around. The thought was absurd, so much so that he shook his head slightly, as if to dispel the idea. He had never been a man who reacted to the whims of emotion, and this was no different. "You don't need to care," he muttered under his breath, forcing the words to make sense in the space between his mind and his chest. He had been trained to think logically, to eliminate distractions. His life was a product of discipline, of carefully constructed decisions. "It's just a kid," he thought, but even as the words left his lips, they sounded hollow. His steps remained steady as he moved forward, but a subtle tension gripped his muscles. It was the kind of pressure he had felt only once before in his life, years ago, when he had been a boy, barely 11, alone in a strange city, freezing on a bench. That night had been a long time ago, but for some reason, the memory stirred like a dark cloud in the back of his mind, casting a shadow over his thoughts. He had been the one knocking on doors back then. He had been the one with nothing but the cold. No, he couldn't do this. Keep walking, he told himself again, his pace quickening, but his feet didn't carry him forward. Instead, he stopped, frozen in the middle of the street, his eyes drawn back to the shadows where she stood. She hadn't moved. She hadn't asked for anything. No demands, no tears, just the same desperate silence, the same unspoken plea. "I'm so cold." And something shifted in him, without fully understanding why. Alexander found himself turning back toward her. The decision felt like a breaking point, a crack in the polished armor of his persona, the city around him, the glass and steel towers. The hum of the night, all of it fell away as he moved toward her. The night felt colder now, somehow, sharper. His coat, the very symbol of his success, felt inadequate against the creeping chill that started to sink deeper into his bones. She didn't flinch when he stopped before her. Her eyes met his, wide and soft, like the dark pools of emotion, too deep to understand. There was no immediate relief in her gaze, no joy at seeing him approach, just a quiet kind of hope, barely there, like the last ember of a dying fire. She didn't move, not at first. She stood there, the cold air biting at her cheeks, her small body trembling. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so disarmed, the last time he had even wanted to help anyone. "Where's your family?" he asked, the words coming out sharper than he meant. His voice seemed strange in the stillness, unfamiliar. Her lips parted, but the wind tore away whatever she had meant to say. She swallowed, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't have a family," she whispered, her voice barely audible, barely there. The words hit him harder than he had expected. Something in him shifted again, an unfamiliar, almost painful sensation gnawing at him. He had thought, perhaps, she would be able to give him an answer, some reason, some story to explain why she was alone in the city at night, why she had appeared in front of him. But there was no explanation, just the cold, and the silent desperation in her eyes. "Where are you going?" he pressed, though he wasn't sure why. Why did he even need to know? "I don't know," she whispered, barely a breath, but the answer was enough. Alexander exhaled, frustration building in his chest, as if the world itself had placed him on the edge of something he didn't understand. Why her? Why now? And then, without fully realizing it, he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out to her. It wasn't grand, no great act of compassion. It was just a simple gesture, but it felt like an undoing of something deep inside him. He took her thin, freezing hand in his. The skin was cold to the touch, so cold it made his own fingers ache. She flinched, but only slightly. The faintest shift in her posture, as if she had expected to be rejected again. For a second, neither of them moved. The wind had picked up again, swirling around them like a living thing. But the air between them was heavy now, charged with something. It wasn't just the cold or the night. It was the uncertainty, the fragile bridge they were building, the moment that neither could control. His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, and for the briefest of seconds, he felt something break. Inside him, it was a moment when everything he had built up over the years, the walls he had constructed, came crashing down. He realized, with a shock that felt like a blow to the chest, that he wasn't the same man who had walked down this street an hour ago. "Come with me," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. It wasn't an offer. It wasn't an invitation. It was just something that needed to be said. Her eyes flickered to his hand, then back up to his face. There was a moment of hesitation, as if she was unsure whether this was another empty promise. She had heard promises, Before, people had offered her things before, only to take them away, but this time, it was different. The warmth in his voice was almost foreign to her, but it wasn't an empty gesture. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward. For the first time, she moved toward him, letting him lead her. And just like that, the night that had seemed so cold and impassable for both of them shifted. Alexander knew, as he guided her toward the building's entrance, that this was not a random encounter. There was something else to this moment, something far more significant than he could have ever imagined. The warmth of the lobby enveloped them as soon as they stepped inside, the heat pressing against the cold that had clung to Eva like a second skin. For a moment, it was almost too much a sudden shock, like stepping into the sun after being trapped in the dark for far too long. The soft golden glow of the lights bathed everything in a warmth that seemed foreign to Eva. She hesitated just inside the doorway, her body stiff, her eyes darting around as if she were unsure of where she could be safe. Alexander noticed it. Immediately, the way she hovered at the edge of the lobby, careful, guarded, like she had been taught to expect the worst at every turn. He stopped, just a few steps inside, and glanced back at her. Eva stood there, still as a statue, the faint tremor in her hands betraying the exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down. She wasn't looking at him, not directly. Her eyes were on the floor, as though she didn't trust herself enough to look up. Alexander felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't about the decision he had made. It wasn't about letting her in. No, this was something different, something that unsettled him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice more uncertain than he meant it to be. There was something about her stillness that made the question feel necessary, but it also felt like an intrusion into a space he wasn't sure he had any right to enter. She nodded once, but the movement was so slight that it was barely noticeable. Her lips pressed together tightly, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She didn't speak, and Alexander, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, didn't press her. He simply waited, watching her as she slowly shifted from one foot to the other. The sound of her bare feet on the marble floor too quiet to notice unless you were paying attention. He motioned toward the elevator at the far end of the room. "It's warmer upstairs. You can rest there." She didn't move at first, just watch him with those big, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything, too much for a child of her age. The hesitation in her gaze was palpable, and for a brief moment, Alexander wondered if she would refuse, if she would turn on her heel and run back out into the cold night. But then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally stepped forward, crossing the marble floor with slow, deliberate steps. He turned toward the elevator, watching her from the corner of his eye. As she walked, the sound of her steps was muffled, as if she didn't want to be heard. Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back, that there was a story behind her silence, something too heavy for her to say out loud. He swiped his key card, and the elevator door slid open without a sound. He stepped inside first, holding the door for her. She lingered for just a second before stepping in, her movements still cautious, almost as if she didn't believe this was happening. As the doors closed behind them, the elevator began its smooth ascent, the soft hum of the machinery the only sound between them. The moment the doors closed, the air in the elevator seemed to shift. Eva moved to the back corner, standing so still that she could have been another piece of furniture, her eyes now on the floor. The tension in her posture was almost unbearable. Alexander, ever the master of control, found himself at a loss. He wasn't used to this feeling, this uncertainty. He was used to knowing exactly what to do, exactly how to fix a problem. But this child, this sudden vulnerability had completely thrown him off course. He didn't know what he was supposed to say, or if he should say anything at all. The city lights outside the elevator's glass walls flickered past, offering only brief glimpses of the world below. Eva's reflection caught in the mirror opposite him, and he saw her, not as a child in need, but as a shadow of something else, a piece of something he didn't understand. The elevator reached the top floor, and the doors opened with a soft chime. He gestured for her to follow him, and she did, stepping out onto the plush carpet of the penthouse hallway. Her eyes darted around, taking in the high-end artwork on the walls, the soft lighting that spilled from sconces along the floor. It was a world so far removed from her own, so foreign, that Alexander wondered if she felt the weight of it, or if it was all just another place that didn't belong to her. He led her to the living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. The lights outside were a distant blur, a sea of glowing dots that seemed so far away. The warmth of the penthouse was a sharp contrast to the cold he knew she had left behind. He motioned toward the couch. "You can sit here. I'll get you something to eat." Eva hesitated again, but then slowly, cautiously, she moved toward the couch. She sank into the soft cushions as if she hadn't sat down in a long time. The weight of her exhaustion settled over her shoulders, and for the first time since they had entered the building, she allowed herself to relax. Alexander watched her from the kitchen, where he had started to prepare something quick, something simple. He didn't want to overthink it. She was hungry, and he could help with that. He poured a glass of water and placed a plate of fruit on the counter, trying not to think about the strange weight in his chest. When he turned back to her, he saw that she hadn't moved from the couch. Her gaze was still distant, still searching, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't looking at the food, but instead, she was staring at the city lights outside the window, lost in thought. He placed the food on the coffee table in front of her and sat across from her. The space between them was vast. The silence that hung in the air felt thick, as though it held the weight of so many unspoken words. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "but you're safe here. I'm not going to turn you away." Eva's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. There was awareness in her gaze, but also something else. Something Alexander couldn't quite place, but it pulled at him nonetheless. She didn't say anything in response. Instead, she reached for the bread and broke off a small piece, her fingers trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. It was a simple act, but the way she did it, the care, the hesitation struck something in him. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen anyone handle food like that, like it was a gift, something too precious to take for granted. The room was quiet except for the sound of her eating, her small movements, and the soft hum of the city beyond the walls. Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night settling around him. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought this girl to his doorstep. What had made her trust him when everything in her life had taught her not to? And as she finished the bread and milk, her eyes once again drifted to the window, watching the snow fall outside, her gaze searching the darkness. Alexander could feel the pull of that unspoken question, that ache for answers neither of them were ready to face. The evening stretched on like a suspended moment in time, the silence between Alexander and Eva filling the space of the grand penthouse. Eva had finished her food, but didn't move much beyond that. Her eyes were still glued to the window, her body almost hunched as if seeking to withdraw into the shadows of the night. The soft hum of the city, the wind outside, the warmth in the room, it all seemed distant, as if neither of them quite belonged here. The fire crackled gently in the corner of the room, but the light it cast only seemed to deepen the shadows, not chase them away. Alexander was still in his chair, but his focus had shifted. He had spent years fine-tuning the art of control, of keeping everything within his grasp. But tonight, nothing felt within his control. There was something about Eva, something beyond the obvious. She was a child, yes, but her presence felt like a disturbance in the air. There was a depth to her that was unsettling in its quiet, its fragility. He leaned forward, pressing his fingertips together, staring at her small figure. Why had she come to him? The thought had nagged at him ever since she stepped into his world. Ever since she appeared on the street that night with nothing but a plea for warmth. She had no way of knowing who he was, no way of understanding the power he wielded. She couldn't have. And yet, here she was sitting in his home, eating the food he had prepared. The one person who had pierced through his carefully constructed world. He tried to focus on the practical matters, the food, the warmth, the roof over her head, but none of it felt like enough. What did she need from him? Eva shifted on the couch, her small body stiffening as she pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders. It was a slight movement, but Alexander noticed it immediately. Her guarded silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. Without thinking, he stood up and walked toward the window. He looked out over the skyline, the cold glass cool. Beneath his fingertips, the city stretched out before him, a sea of lights and buildings, each one a testament to his power, his empire. It was all his everything he had ever worked for, but tonight, it felt empty. A sharp breath caught in his throat. He could see her in the reflection of the glass. Sitting behind him, it was as though the reflection of the night, the view of the city that had always made him feel untouchable, had somehow transformed in that moment. Her small presence, so out of place in this world, seemed to change the atmosphere, twisting it into something new, something unfamiliar. He turned slowly to face her. The quiet was thick, suffocating. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a raw sense of vulnerability, an unfamiliar sting at the edges of his carefully protected heart. It wasn't pity, it wasn't just compassion, it was something deeper, something that made him question the life he had built. Why had she come? To him? Eva looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his in the mirror, and for a brief moment, Alexander saw something he hadn't expected, something in the rawness of her expression. It was as if, for the first time, she had allowed herself to be seen. I don't belong here, do I? Her voice was barely a whisper, but it hit him like a punch to the chest. The question wasn't one he could easily answer, and for the first time that evening, Alexander hesitated. He had spent years building a life where everything fit neatly into place: control, precision, the sharp lines of success, and now, this child, this fragile, broken child had come into his world and shattered everything he thought he knew. "You're safe here," he said, his voice more uncertain than he had intended. It was the first thing that came to his mind, but even as the words left his lips, he felt the weight of their inadequacy. He wasn't sure what it meant for her to be safe. Safety didn't belong in his world. His world was built on power, on decisions made without hesitation. But her world had been nothing but uncertainty. Eva didn't respond. She just sat there, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of the blanket. Her eyes turned to the floor. The silence between them deepened. Alexander watched her, his mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that had inexplicably dropped into his life. He was used to solving problems, but this was no ordinary problem. This was a child who had been outcast, forgotten, discarded, by a world that had no place for her, and now, somehow, she had found him. But why? His thoughts were interrupted by the faintest sound of small, almost imperceptible gasp from Eva. He turned to see her hunched over, her hand clutching at her stomach. The shift in her body was subtle, but the tension was clear. "Eva?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp, his instincts kicking in. What was happening? But she didn't answer. Instead, she slowly stood up, her face contorting in pain. Her breath came out in quick, shallow bursts, her small hands pressing against her sides. Alexander took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "Eva," he said again, this time his tone laced with urgency. His hands reached out toward her, but she flinched, pulling away from him. "Please, don't," she whispered, her voice hoarse, strained. The sight of her pain was like a slap in the face. Alexander's mind raced. What was going on? What did she need? The one thing he knew for sure was that he had no idea how to help her. He had spent his life managing numbers, contracts, deals, things that could be solved with a simple decision. But this was different. This was real. Eva's breathing quickened, and she looked up at him, her face pale. The tears that had been building in her eyes finally began to spill over, tracing the lines of her cheeks like rivers of sorrow. She was breaking, and he didn't know how to stop it. "I can't go back," she whispered through ragged breaths. I can't. And then it hit him, her words, soft but filled with a depth of terror, the weight of her fear. She wasn't just in pain. She wasn't just hungry or cold. She was running from something, someone. The city's lights blurred around him as the realization sank in. She wasn't just a lost child on a cold night. She was someone in hiding. Someone who had seen enough to know that the world didn't offer second chances. He reached out to her again, this time more gently, his hand hovering just beside her. What had she left behind? What was it she was running from? Eva's gaze locked with his, her eyes wide and full of terror. The weight of her fear was more tangible than anything he had ever experienced, and as her gaze pierced through him, the answer came like a thunderclap, crashing into his chest. He had opened the door to something he didn't understand, something dangerous. Eva was no longer just a child on the streets. She was a puzzle he wasn't sure he could solve, and with that realization, everything about the night, the warmth of the penthouse, the illusion of safety seemed to collapse. In on itself, the storm had only just begun. The sound of the fire crackling in the hearth was the only thing that filled the silence between them. Eva sat on the edge of the couch, her small frame still tense, every inch of her rigid with uncertainty. She had eaten, she had rested, but it was clear that something was still gnawing at her. Her eyes flickered constantly to the door, the window, the shadows of the penthouse. Her gaze too restless to guard it for someone so small. She looked like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, her every move betraying the fear that held her in place. Alexander stood by the window, watching the city unfold beneath him like a vast, indifferent ocean. The skyline, glittering and unreachable, seemed to mock him in that moment. It had been his ambition that had built this world, that had given him everything he had, and yet, standing there, the room behind him heavy with silence and the weight of her unspoken words, Alexander couldn't help but feel that it was all meaningless. For the first time, he wondered if it had ever truly mattered. His thoughts kept circling back to the same question: why her? Why now, a child? On a night like this, knocking at his door, he had spent years carefully removing emotion from his life, locking away the things that could distract him, the things that could make him weak. He had become a man whose decisions were made by numbers, by logic, by power, and yet, here he was, on the edge of something he couldn't understand. His carefully constructed world beginning to crack. Eva, with her hollow gaze and fragile body, had opened the door he hadn't known existed, and now, it was too late to close it. He turned from the window and looked at her again. She hadn't moved since he had sat down earlier, her small hands still clenched tightly in her lap. He could see the shadows under her eyes, the tiredness in her posture, the weight of the world pressing down on her even in this safe place. Eva. His voice was softer than he intended. You don't have to be afraid here. You're not alone anymore. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, but there was no recognition in them, no gratitude. Only that same guarded look, like she was expecting him to pull the rug out from under her at any moment. She had learned to survive in a world that took everything from her. I'm not afraid, she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm just tired. She paused, her breath shaky, tired of being told to keep going, tired of running. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest at her words, something he couldn't explain, something that left him standing there, frozen. She wasn't just an orphan. She wasn't just a lost child in a big, indifferent city. She was a survivor. But survival hadn't been enough for her, and for reasons that confused him, he wanted to know more. He wanted to understand. What are you running from? He asked before he could stop himself. The question had been there, buried in the back of his mind since the moment she'd walked into his penthouse. He needed an answer. He needed to know the truth. The change in Eva was immediate. The walls that had been so carefully constructed around her snapped back into place, and for a brief moment, her eyes hardened. It was a shift so sudden, so violent, that it made Alexander take a step back. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was someone who had been forced to grow up too fast, forced to carry too much, forced to live with secrets that no child should have to bear. She didn't answer him right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in tight, anxious knots. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, the words thick with something Alexander couldn't place. I don't remember a time when I wasn't running, she said, her gaze turning away from him to look out at the city below. I don't know where I'm supposed to go, or who I'm supposed to be. All I know is that I've been running from them for so long. The chill in the air seemed to grow even colder, as though her words had reached into the room and frozen the very air between them. Alexander's chest tightened as he tried to piece together what she was saying, but the pieces didn't fit. He didn't understand. Who was she running from? Who could make a child this afraid? You don't have to run anymore, he said, trying to steady his voice. But it cracked with an emotion he couldn't quite control. You're safe here. You can stay as long as you need to. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, a mixture of disbelief and fear flickering in them. You don't understand, she said sharply, her voice trembling. I'm not safe anywhere. She pressed her hands to her temples, her small body racked with a tremor that seemed to vibrate through the room. They'll find me. They always find me. The weight of her words hit him harder than anything he had experienced in a long time. He had built his empire on the idea that he could control everything. That power was the answer to everything. But now, here he was, faced with a child who was caught in something far beyond his control, something he couldn't see, couldn't touch. He crossed the room, his mind racing, his steps quickening as a strange urgency settled over him. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know what he could possibly say to fix this. Who are they? He demanded, his voice louder than he intended. Who are you running from, Eva? She flinched at the sound of his voice, as if his words were a slap. She stood up, shaking her head violently, backing away from him. I don't want to talk about it, she said, her voice breaking. I can't. Her words hung in the air, unfinished, as her gaze darted around the room. She was trapped, cornered in a space that was supposed to be safe. But to her, it was just another cage. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just afraid of the world outside. She was afraid of the things that were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. The things she had been running from, and somehow she had found her way to him, to this penthouse. To this moment, the doorbell rang suddenly, a sharp, insistent sound that made both of them freeze. It was loud, jarring, and out of place in the quiet, tension-filled room. Eva froze, her eyes wide with fear, her body stiffening. Alexander's heart raced. He didn't know who could be at the door at this hour, but he felt the shift in the room. The air had changed. He could feel it in the way Eva was looking at him now, her eyes wide with something that resembled terror. The weight of the night, the secrets, and the fears that hung over them both now seemed to settle in his chest like an anchor. He moved slowly toward the door, the sound of his footsteps, drowned by the frantic beating of his heart. Who was it? When he opened the door, no one was there, just the cold night air, sweeping in like an unwelcome guest. And then he heard it, a faint sound, soft but unmistakable, a whisper from the shadows. You can't hide from us, Eva. The voice was chilling. It was the last thing he expected to hear. And as Alexander stood there, frozen in the doorway, the realization hit him harder than any fear he had ever known. Eva was not just a lost child. She was running from something far darker, and now that darkness had followed her here. The door slammed shut behind Alexander with a sudden, forceful click, and he stood there in the hallway, his body stiff and cold, his breath shallow. The words, the chilling whisper from the shadows outside, still echoed in his mind. You can't hide from us, Eva. His pulse hammered in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the panic rising inside him. He turned quickly, the sound of his feet slapping against the cold marble floor unnervingly loud in the silence of the penthouse. But when he reached the living room, Eva was gone. Her blanket, discarded on the couch, was the only sign that she had been there at all. Panic began to bubble within him. Where did she go? His eyes searched the room, darting over every corner, every shadow. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass or signs of an intruder. But the sudden absence of her presence, that feeling of quiet urgency that had hung in the air, left an unsettling void in its place. He called out her name, but the words felt hollow in the vastness of the penthouse. His voice seemed swallowed by the towering walls, the sleek modernity of the space now feeling more like a trap than a refuge. Eva. His voice cracked with frustration, and his heart skipped a beat when there was no answer. A soft noise in the hallway caught his attention, and his head snapped toward the source. A door creaked open. He rushed down the hall, his eyes landing on the door to the guest bedroom, which was ajar, just slightly enough for him to glimpse the dark, empty space inside. He pushed the door open, his body tense, but stopped short when he saw her. Eva stood in the middle of the room, her small figure barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. Her back was to him, but it was clear she hadn't moved for a while. She was frozen in place, staring at something on the floor, her body trembling with the force of what he could only assume was fear. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, barely a breath, as if the air itself was thick with a weight too heavy to bear. They know. They always know. The words hit him like a blow, the intensity of her fear palpable. Who knows, Eva? Who's after you? He stepped forward slowly, but his feet felt as if they were sinking into the floor. Every step toward her felt like an intrusion, like a violation of the fragile boundary she had placed between herself and the world. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and terror. Her skin had gone pale, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. But the words wouldn't come. Alexander's hand reached out instinctively, but she flinched, pulling away from him like he was the very thing she was trying to escape. Don't, she whispered, her voice strained. You don't understand. If you knew what they'd do to you. The words trailed off, her eyes scanning the room, as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows, something hidden, something waiting. Alexander could see the panic creeping into her eyes. But the more she pulled away, the more he felt his own grip on reality slipping. She wasn't just scared of something outside this penthouse. She was scared of him, too. What's going on, Eva? His voice was urgent now, the edges of his calm slipping away. He needed answers. He couldn't let this slip through his fingers. But she was too far gone. She backed away from him, her eyes wild as she stumbled toward the corner of the room, clutching her arms around herself as though she could protect herself from something only she could see. They're not just looking for me, Alexander, she said. Her words rushed, as if trying to make him understand. They're looking for you, too. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air between them. Oh wait, that neither of them could escape. What do you mean? He barely recognized his own voice as it cracked under the weight of her statement. The air felt too thick now, like it was pressing down on him from all sides, and the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. His breath misted in front of him. He could feel that something was closing in. Ava's eyes flickered toward the window, then back to him. She shook her head in disbelief. They know who you are. They always have. They know everything about you, about me. Her words were a dagger, but she wasn't finished. Her hand rose, her small fingers trembling as she pointed at the floor, at a place just beyond his reach, just past the threshold of his control. It's in the walls. It's in the floors. They've always been here, watching, waiting. Alexander's heart stopped in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears. He stared at her, confused, horrified, and for a moment, he thought he might lose himself in the madness of her words. But something about the way she said it, something about the way she looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and terror, made him realize this wasn't a joke. This wasn't some fantasy. This wasn't just a child's fear. Whose? They? His voice barely registered, but the question was heavy in the room, like the first piece of a puzzle that might just pull the rest of the picture together. Ava's eyes filled with tears. They're everywhere, and they'll never stop coming until they find me. It hit him then. The truth was hidden, buried deep in the layers of fear that wrapped themselves around her heart like chains. They weren't just coming for Eva. They were coming for him, too. He moved toward her again, but this time, his body felt slow, weighed down by the gravity of her words. He didn't know who they were, or what they wanted, but he knew something was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the tense silence that had stretched between them. Suddenly, the sharp ring of the doorbell sliced through the room, cutting through the thick tension like a knife. Ava's face went white. No, not yet, she whispered, backing up toward the corner again. Her eyes darted toward the door. Alexander's chest tightened as he stood frozen in place. He glanced toward the door, feeling the weight of the moment crashing down on him. Who could it be? Before he could take a step, the door swung open on its own. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, cloaked in shadow, a silhouette that seemed too familiar to be real. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the cold grip of terror. The people Eva had been running from, they were here, and they had found him. The figure in the doorway was still, its presence looming like an omen in the dimly lit penthouse. Alexander's heart thudded in his chest, an erratic beat that seemed to synchronize with the pounding in his ears. The air in the room had become suffocating, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was in control. Ava's breath hitched as she recoiled into the corner, her wide eyes fixed on the shadowed figure. Her body trembled so violently that the blanket she had wrapped around her fell to the floor. She was too afraid to speak, too afraid to even move, and yet, her eyes didn't leave the figure standing at the door, a silent, ominous presence that had stepped from the darkness itself. Who are you? Alexander asked, his voice firmer than he felt, his instinct to protect rising in his chest. He took a step forward, his gaze shifting from the mysterious figure to Eva, who now seemed smaller than ever, a fragile, delicate creature crushed by something far beyond her control. The figure in the doorway didn't speak at first. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure stepped into the room, and the light revealed just enough for Alexander to see the glint of steel and old, worn dagger sheathed at the man's side. For the briefest of moments, time stopped. Ava's body tensed, and her eyes locked onto the figure, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She didn't run. She didn't scream. Instead, she stood frozen, her mouth trembling but silent. Whatever had brought her to this moment, whatever fear was contained within her, had gripped her with such force that even the sight of the man before them didn't cause her to retreat. Alexander felt the weight of the situation begin to settle on him. This wasn't just a random intruder. This man knew Eva. He wasn't here by chance, he was here for a reason. And that reason had something to do with Eva's past, with the darkness she had been running from, and somehow, against all logic, that darkness had found its way into Alexander's life. "What do you want?" Alexander asked again, his voice low but steady, the tension now lining every word. The figure, still silent, stepped closer, his movements deliberate, slow. As he crossed the room, the air seemed to grow colder, the heat from the fire in the corner doing nothing to push back the chill that had suddenly settled over them. The man's eyes dark, unreadable, like a predator stalking its prey never left Eva. Alexander could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he moved closer to her. Standing between the stranger and Eva, "Stay away from her." The figure paused, and for the first time, the tension in the room seemed to snap. "She's not your problem," the stranger said, his voice low, cold, like a distant echo from another world. "But you're about to find out she is." Alexander's pulse quickened as the words hit him. He had no idea who this man was or how he had found them, but something in his voice, in the way he carried himself, told Alexander this wasn't just a coincidence. The figure's eyes finally left Eva and turned to Alexander, the predatory glint in them sharp and piercing. "You've been living your life in the dark, Grant. You've been blind to the truth of the world. You've built your empire, your fortress, and you've stayed isolated, controlling everything around you, but you haven't controlled this." Alexander's breath caught in his throat as the realization sank in. The man wasn't just talking about Eva. He was talking about him, about the life he had carefully constructed, about everything he had worked for. There was something in the way the man spoke, something so full of knowing, that Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life had been leading to this moment. "You have no idea what's coming for you," the figure continued, his words dripping with a venomous truth. "Eva was never supposed to come here. You were never supposed to be involved." But now, the figure let the sentence hang in the air, its weight pressing down on both of them, and Alexander's chest tightened in response. What was coming? What had he done? The decision to open his door to Eva had been impulsive, an act of compassion or weakness, but it was more than that now. This was the beginning of something bigger. Eva's face had gone pale. She was trembling, her hands curled tightly into fists, her lips pressed together in a line of restrained panic. It was clear now that she had known this moment was inevitable. "What did you do?" Alexander's voice was low, tinged with disbelief. His eyes locked onto the figure as he took another step forward, his body instinctively pushing Eva further behind him, as though his presence could shield her from the storm that was about to break. The man's lips twisted into something that almost resembled a smile, though it was more a grimace of satisfaction. "I didn't do anything," he said softly. "I've only been watching. I didn't want it to come to this." Alexander's head spun with confusion, but the truth was beginning to fall into place. There was something Eva hadn't told him, something she couldn't say. The mystery of who was chasing her, the terror she lived in every moment, was a mystery that had followed her here, and now, this man, whoever he was, had followed her into his world. "Get out." The command came from Alexander, his voice hoarse with anger and fear. But the man didn't budge. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather envelope, placing it on the table before Alexander with slow deliberation. "This is for you," the man said, his voice dripping with an unsettling calm. "You'll understand. Soon enough, they'll come for you both. The moment you open it, there's no turning back. You can't undo what's been set in motion." With that, the man turned and walked out of the penthouse, leaving behind the door swinging slightly on its hinges, and the tension in the air that refused to dissipate. Alexander stood there for a long moment, his hand hovering above the envelope. Every instinct in him screamed to destroy it, to walk away from whatever this was. But something kept him rooted in place. What had Eva been running from? What had they been running from? He turned to look at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. Eva's face had drained of color, and she was trembling in earnest now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if she were bracing herself for something even worse to come. "What is it?" he asked softly, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered to the envelope, and then to him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Alexander saw her fear completely undiluted. "You're not safe here. No one is." The city outside was still, frozen in the grip of the night. But the world they had known was about to shift, and neither Alexander nor Eva would be able to escape what was coming for them.